Welcome to a special broadcast of Jackman Radio. I'm your host, Mike Jackman, and today marks the 57th year since the assassination of then Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who, of course, was running for president on June 5th, 1968, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And, some new information has come out recently with the files that have been released, but I really feel like over the years there has been a lot of information that even came out in the early 70s. You had a documentary called The Second Gun, which I have a link to in the description here, which came out in 1973, which is a really thorough and interesting documentary, which has witnesses like the maitre d' there, Carl Euchre, who was in the kitchen at the time with Senator Kennedy, as well as other people. I believe Paul Schrade is included, who we had on Jackman Radio, was one of his last interviews before he passed away a couple years ago. And today I just wanted to read an article that actually came out out of all places on CNN back in 2012, which talks about an actress named Nina Roman, who was, in The Ambassador and knew Senator Kennedy. Her name now is Nina Rhodes Hughes. I think she got married, or had a name change or something like that. And I believe she's still around, either 90 or 91 years old. But she gave an interview back in 2012 to CNN talking about the assassination. And let's call it up here. All right, so RFK assassination witness tells CNN there was a second shooter. So I want to talk about, the idea and possibility of a second shooter today, some of the eyewitness testimony, some of the inconsistencies, and I do want to play a clip of RFK Jr. talking to Eric and I just over 2 years ago, the day after he announced his run for president, talking about his father's assassination, which was a really intense few minutes as part of our longer interview that we did. But just going over this article here from CNN from 2012, we have Nina Roman. As a federal court prepares to rule on a challenge to Sirhan Sirhan's conviction in the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, a long overlooked witness to the murder is telling her story. She heard two guns firing during the 1968 shooting, and authorities altered her account of the crime. So obviously, since this article has come out, there's been other hearings and other parole hearings for Sirhan Sirhan. And the parole board did, a couple years ago, recommend to have him be released. And RFK Jr. wrote a letter. Mark Robert, who we've had on the podcast, testified on behalf of Paul Schrade, who, of course, was shot in the head, who I mentioned a moment ago, calling for Sirhan's release. And Governor Newsom said no. So he ultimately, Sirhan has not been released, but it's possible. It's still possible that he could be. I think he's up again for parole. So some of the info in this article might be dated, but I still think there's some important information to share. Nina Rhodes Hughes wants the world to know that, despite what history says, Sirhan was not the only gunman firing shots when Kennedy was murdered a few feet away from her at a Los Angeles hotel. What has come out is that there was another shooter to my right, Rhodes Hughes said in an exclusive interview with CNN. The truth has got to be told. No more cover-ups. Her voice at times became emotional. Rhodes Hughes described for CNN various details of the assassination, her long frustration with the official reporting of her account, and her reasons for speaking out. I think to assist me in healing, although you're never 100% healed from that, but more important, to bring justice. For me, it's hopeful and sad that it's only coming out now instead of before, but at least now instead of never, she said, by phone from her home near Vancouver, British Columbia. Okay, so she's living in Canada now. So Sirhan, the only person arrested, tried, and convicted in the shooting of Kennedy, and 5 other people, is serving a life sentence in Coalinga, California. And I guess Sirhan has had a pretty sterling record while he's been in prison. You know, he's been doing Alcoholics Anonymous and, substance treatment for that. Because, of course, part of the story is that he's just a little guy and he wasn't really a drinker. And the night of the assassination, he drank, I think, 3 or 4 Tom Collins, which, is a heavier drink for someone like that who doesn't drink. And, that could be part of why he's always said he doesn't remember what happened. But, I'm of the opinion, he obviously was there. He was firing a gun. Some researchers like Lisa Pease, whose book I highly recommend. We have that included in the links as well, A Lie Too Big to Fail. And we've had her on the podcast. She's done decades of excellent research into the RFK assassination. She contends that Sirhan was firing blanks. Paul Schrade always said that he was shot in the head by Sirhan, but he never believed that Sirhan actually fired the shots that killed Senator Kennedy. So we'll get into that a little bit more. But in reading more on this, the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles is set to rule on a request that he be released. Yeah, we already went over that. He's not been released. At his 1969 trial, Sirhan's original defense team never contested the prosecution's case that Sirhan was the one and only shooter in Kennedy's assassination. Now, that's interesting, too, because Sirhan's defense, basically, they weren't really going to try and show evidence that, the ballistics evidence and the possibility of other shooters and more shots, which they, of course, knew about. One of Sirhan's defense attorneys, Grant Cooper, was actually, connected to another case where there was some mafia involvement. And, Ryan Dawson, who we've had on the program, has done some phenomenal research on that. And also in the notes, the description, we have a link to his recent interview on Rumble with Myron Gaines, where he really goes into the mechanics of the shooting. And I can't recommend checking that out enough. So we do have that link. So make sure you click on that to check that out. So at his original trial, they contended that he was the one and only shooter in Kennedy's assassination. Sirhan testified at his trial that he had killed Kennedy with 20 years of malice aforethought and was convicted and sentenced to death, which was reduced to life in prison in 1972. So that's an interesting one. That's one where they always kind of hinge the whole thing on Sirhan and say, well, there you go. He admitted to it. There's, of course, the Israel-Palestine angle. Sirhan was Palestinian born, but it's important to remember he was actually a Christian, so he was not Muslim. So a lot of people like to say, oh, he's the original Palestinian terrorist. And, it's relevant still to today with what's going on with Israel right now and Palestine. And I really, I don't think had, JFK lived or RFK lived, we would be seeing the state of the world right now with respect to foreign policy and what's going on in Israel, because contrary to what a lot of reports say, the Kennedy brothers were not very trustworthy of Israel's leaders and of Israel's policy, even going back to when JFK was a senator from Massachusetts and then running for president in 1960. He met with a lot of, Zionist type figures who were skeptical of him, but he, of course, had to convince them, for his run. But he also came out of that meeting basically saying, wow, these guys are, these guys want to run my foreign policy. I'm not taking their money. I don't want to be influenced by them. So that's a real interesting thing to think about. And of course, JFK's heated letters with Ben Gurion, the leader of Israel at the time, who ended up resigning in 1963, is another really interesting thread. So back to the article. After the trial, Sirhan recanted his courtroom confession. This is interesting. In the recent federal court filing, state prosecutors led by California Attorney General Kamala Harris argue that even if there was a second gunman involved in the Kennedy shooting, Sirhan hasn't proven his innocence and he's still guilty of murder under California's vicarious liability law. So this was back when Kamala was AG of California, a position that, many would argue she wasn't really competent to hold, as well as vice president. Just ask the voters, ask 77 million voters what they said last fall. But what's interesting to me is she's this, big Democratic figure. and of course won't look at the evidence, even if it does show there was a second gunman. And then, of course, Newsom, who wants to run in 2028, and Kamala probably wants to run again in 2028. They're going to just toe the official line on this stuff, even though RFK Jr. has been out there pretty loud for a number of years now, talking about the evidence, and we'll get to a clip of RFK Jr. in just a minute here. Sirhan's new legal team disputes Harris's assertion about the statute. So we'll go back down to more information here. That's really interesting from Nina Rhodes Hughes. So prosecutors are contending that Rhodes Hughes heard no more than 8 gunshots during the assassination. In court papers filed in February, Harris and prosecutors argued that Rhodes Hughes was among several witnesses reporting that only 8 shots were fired and that all these shots came from the same direction. What's interesting is that she actually, when she talked to the FBI and investigators, she is saying she did not say it was just 8 shots, and they'll get to more of that in the article. Sirhan's lawyers are challenging those assertions. In response, also filed in federal court in Los Angeles, the defense team, led by New York attorney William Pepper, who actually passed away last year, I believe, got a chance to meet him once back in 2007 at a conference, and he did some fantastic work on the RFK assassination, as well as the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. He represented the King family and wrote 2 or 3 fantastic books about that. Pepper contends that the FBI misrepresented her eyewitness account and that she actually had heard a total of 12 to 14 shots, which I always thought was interesting because you have the Van Prague audio where he does an analysis and listens to it and contends that there were probably more than 12 or 13 shots. She identified 15 errors, including the FBI alteration, which quoted her as hearing only 8 shots, which she explicitly denied was what she had told them, Sirhan's lawyers argued, citing a previously published statement from Rhodes Hughes. Rhodes Hughes was a television actress in 1968 who worked as a volunteer fundraiser for Kennedy's presidential campaign. The FBI report indicates that Rhodes Hughes was indeed inside the kitchen service pantry of the Ambassador Hotel during the crucial moments of the Kennedy shooting, but she contends the Bureau got details of her story wrong, including her assertions about the number of shots fired and where the shots were fired from. She tells CNN she informed the authorities in 1968 that the number of gunshots she counted in the pantry exceeded 8, which would have been more than the maximum Sirhan could have fired. And some of the shots came from a location in the pantry other than Sirhan's position. So this is really important. Sirhan's gun only held 8 bullets, and according to multiple eyewitnesses, he got off 2 shots before being piled on by Rayford Johnson and Rosie Greer and Carl Euchre and others who were in the pantry. And so he had 2 shots that went off. One hit Paul Schrade in the head, and the other went into the ceiling or into a door jamb. And then he was being held down, and he was still firing, but the gun was not near RFK, and he was kind of on a steam table. And he fired 6 more shots. 5 more people were hit. And as RFK Jr. would tell us, 1 person was hit twice. So that accounts for all the bullets. And yet we have FBI photographs of the ceiling tile that has a bullet in it. And we got door jambs that have multiple slugs in it. And then, of course, the 4 shots that hit RFK, 1 passing harmlessly through his jacket and 3 being pretty much contact shots. So the ballistics are really questionable. And Thomas Noguchi, who did the autopsy, we'll talk a little bit more about him later, concluded that they were the fatal shot was behind the right ear at a distance of no more than 1 to 2 inches. And the problem is with that, Sirhan was always in front of Senator Kennedy between 2 and 5 feet, and it was never behind him and never got close enough to have actually fired those shots. So that's like the crux of the case right there. So it's just very interesting that still to this day, 57 years, a lot of people don't realize this information. Sometimes you have stories like this that sneak out into the press, and it's interesting to see. So we'll continue on with the CNN piece. Props to CNN for putting this out. Sometimes they do, CNN and Fox, for the corporate mouthpieces that they are, sometimes they sneak in stuff like this. There's some nuggets. Robert Kennedy was the most seriously wounded of the 6 people shot inside the hotel pantry on June 5th, 1968, only moments after the New York senator had claimed victory in California's Democratic primary election. The presidential candidate died the next day. All other victims survived. The Los Angeles County coroner determined that 3 bullets struck Kennedy's body and a 4th passed harmlessly through his clothing. Police and prosecutors declared the 4 bullets were among 8 fired by Sirhan acting alone. Rhodes Hughes tells CNN the FBI's 8-shot claim is completely false. She says the Bureau twisted things that she told FBI agents when they interviewed her as an assassination witness in 1968, and she says Kamala Harris and her prosecutors are simply parroting the Bureau's report. I never said 8 shots. I never said it, Rhodes Hughes told CNN. But if the Attorney General is saying it, then she's going according to what the FBI chose to put in their report. There were more than 8 shots, Rhodes Hughes said by phone. She says that during the FBI interview in her Los Angeles home, 1 month after the assassination, she told the agents that she'd heard 12 to 14 shots. There were at least 12, maybe 14. So that's more than one gun. And I know there were because I heard the rhythm in my head, she said. She says she believes senior FBI officials altered statements she made to the agents to conform with what they wanted the public to believe, period. And that kind of reminds me of Sandra Serrano, who was a 17 or 18-year-old teenage campaign worker for RFK at the time, who sadly passed away a couple years ago. And her testimony is featured in a really great documentary from 2008 called RFK Must Die, written and directed by Shane O'Sullivan, a fine Irishman who's been looking into the RFK assassination for probably well over 20 years. And basically, she contends that after the shooting, a young woman with kind of a pointy nose wearing a polka dot dress came running out and said, we shot him. And Sandra Serrano said back to the woman, shot who? And then she said, we shot the senator. And then she just continued off into the night, down the stairs, kind of near the outside of the Ambassador Hotel near the fire escape. And Sandra Serrano never changed her story, but she was certainly bullied by the authorities. She had this audio you can hear in these documentaries. A couple of these LAPD goons who were also intelligence connected, Manuel Pena, and I believe the other one's name is Hank Hernandez, who you can really hear in the tape, just really bullying her, getting her to change her story and tell her that she never saw the girl in the dress running out, and she must be mistaken, and she's lying, and for the memory of Senator Kennedy and the good of his family and the nation, you have to change your story. So if there wasn't any funny business going on, why would you have him in there interrogating this poor young girl, who was probably already traumatized beyond? So that was always a interesting nugget in the case. And sadly, a lot of the witnesses and people who spoke out against the official narrative are passing away. Paul Schrade died a couple years ago. Like I said, I think he was 96 or 97 years old. Sandra Serrano passed away a few years ago. Juan Romero, who was the busboy who had the rosary and was cradling Senator Kennedy and kind of being there for him when he was on the ground, he also passed away some years back. So I think it's really important to get this eyewitness testimony and kind of blast it out there and not forget these people who were really at great detriment to their own health and safety and well-being and mental well-being, didn't change their stories about what they saw and stuck to their guns, so to speak. Back to the CNN piece. When they say only 8 shots, the anger within me is so great that I get very emotional because it is so untrue. Contacted by CNN for comment, Sirhan lead attorney William Pepper called the alleged FBI alteration of Rhodes Hughes' story deplorable and criminal, and said it mirrors the experience of other witnesses. And like we said, there were other witnesses that mentioned more than 8 shots. Law enforcement investigators have always maintained that only 8 shots were fired in the RFK assassination, all of them by Sirhan. His small caliber handgun could hold no more than 8 bullets. But released witness interview summaries show at least 4 other people told authorities in 1968 that they heard what could have been more than 8 shots. The following 4 witnesses and their accounts appear not in FBI reports but in LAPD summaries. Jesse Unruh, who was the Speaker of the California Assembly at the time, told police that he was within 20 to 30 feet behind Kennedy when suddenly he heard a crackle of what he initially thought were exploding firecrackers. I don't really quite remember how many reports there were, Unruh told the LAPD. It sounded to me like somewhere between 5 and 10. And then Frank Mankiewicz, who had been Kennedy's campaign press secretary, told police that he was trying to catch up to the senator when he suddenly heard sounds that also seemed to him to be a popping of firecrackers. When an LAPD detective asked Mankiewicz how many of the sounds he'd heard, he answered, "It seemed to me I heard a lot. If indeed it had turned out to have been firecrackers, I probably would have said about 10, but I'm sure it was less than that." Estelyn Duffy LaHive, who had been a Kennedy supporter, told police that she was standing just outside the kitchen's pantry's west entrance when the shooting erupted. "I thought I heard at least about 10 shots," she told the LAPD. Booker Griffin, another Kennedy supporter, told police that he had just entered the pantry through its east entrance and suddenly heard 2 quick shots, followed by a slight pause, and then what sounded like it could have been 10 or 12 additional shots. An analysis of recently uncovered tape recording of the shooting detected at least 13 shot sounds erupting over a period of less than 6 seconds. The audio tape was recorded at the Ambassador Hotel by freelance newspaper reporter Stanislav Brzezinski and is the only known soundtrack of the assassination. Audio expert Philip von Prague, who I mentioned earlier, told CNN that his analysis establishes the Brzezinski recording as authentic and the 13 sounds electronically detected on the recording as gunshots. "The gunshots are established by virtue of my computer analysis of waveform patterns, which clearly distinguishes gunshots from other phenomena," he said in an email. "This would include phenomena that to human hearing are often perceived as exploding firecrackers, popping camera flashbulbs, or bursting balloons." Van Prague's Brzezinski recording findings are now a major point of controversy among new evidence being argued between the two sides in the Sirhan federal court case. Harris contends that his findings amount to an interpretation or opinion that is not universally accepted by acoustic experts. So that's kind of in line with, "We will become unburdened by what has been. I will be unburdened by any evidence contrary to the official story." That's Kamala for you. CNN reported on Van Prague's analysis in 2008 and then with additional stories in a segment in 2009. Shots fired from 2 different locations. California prosecutors have argued that witnesses heard shots coming from only one location, but Rhodes Hughes tells CNN that while the first 2 or 3 shots she heard came from Sirhan's position several feet in front of her, she also heard gunshots to my right where Robert Kennedy was. According to the autopsy report, the coroner concluded that the senator's body and clothing were struck from behind at right rear by 4 bullets fired at upward angles and at point-blank range. Yet witnesses said Sirhan fired somewhat downward, almost horizontally, from several feet in front of Kennedy, and witnesses did not report the senator's back as ever being exposed to Sirhan or his gun. Now, some people arguing that point will say, well, after the first shot, Bobby put his hands up like this and turned, which is possible. But even after the first shot or 2, still, with the forensic evidence with the bullet trajectories, it wouldn't have been possible for Sirhan to be like this with his gun. Even having extended his arm out, obviously, to get to be 2 inches because he never got that close. But there was somebody standing behind RFK who would have been able to do that, and we'll get into that. In his analysis of the Brzezinski sound recording, Philip Van Praagh found that 5 of the gunshots captured in the tape were fired opposite the direction of Sirhan's 8 shots. Van Praagh also concluded that those 5 shots, the 3rd, 5th, 8th, 10th, and 12th gunshots within the 13-shot sequence, displayed an acoustical frequency anomaly, indicating that the alleged second gun's make and model were different from Sirhan's weapon. Okay, and then it just kind of talks about how she got in with the campaign, and she was a supporter of RFK, and she ended up in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel kitchen. She also says that while she was behind Senator Kennedy, looking at the back of his head and hearing the first 2 or 3 gunshots, Kennedy did not appear to be struck by bullets at that point. Oh, so that's an interesting point. She, believing the first shots were merely flashbulbs, says she then took her eyes off the senator while turning leftward and caught her first glimpse of Sirhan standing in front of Kennedy and to the candidate's left. She told CNN that the 5'5" tall Sirhan was propped up on a steam table several feet ahead of her and slightly to her own left. Rhodes Hughes says part of her view of Sirhan was obstructed and she could not see the gun in his hand, but she says that as soon as she caught sight of Sirhan, she then heard more shots coming from somewhere past her right side and near Kennedy. She told CNN that at that point she was hearing much more rapid fire than she initially had heard. In his recent analysis of the Brzezinski recording, Philip Van Praagh found that some of the tape's 13 captured shot sounds were fired too rapidly at intervals too close together for all of the gunshots in the pantry to have come from Sirhan's Ivor Johnson revolver alone. Sirhan's lawyers report in their federal court papers that gunshot echoes have been ruled out as the cause of the Brzezinski recording's double shots. Ricochets are also ruled out, according to Pasadena, California, forensic audio engineers who verified Van Praagh's Brzezinski findings for the 2007 investigation Discovery Channel television documentary Conspiracy Test, the RFK Assassination. Rhodes Hughes tells CNN she heard gunshots coming from someplace not far from her right side, even while Sirhan was being subdued several feet in front of her. During all of that time, there are shots coming to my right, she said. People are falling all around me. I see a man sliding down a wall. Then I see Senator Kennedy lying on his back, bleeding. And I remember, oh no, oh my God. And the next thing I know, I'm ducking, but also in complete shock as to what's going on. And then I passed out. And then she said she ran out of the pantry when she came to, yelling, "They've killed him, they've killed him. Oh my God, he's dead. They've killed him," she told CNN. Now, the reason I said they is because I knew there was more than one shooter involved. Little more than 25 hours later, Kennedy was pronounced dead at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. And with these, on a side note here, with the files that were released in May, which you can check out at archives.gov/research/RFK. I want to show those to you guys before we continue on with the article. Yeah, right here. Records related to the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Tulsi Gabbard was hugely instrumental in getting these out, of course, as well as RFK Jr. And this is something that we talked to both of them about on Jackman Radio, or at least, during the campaign. We talked to Bobby about it on the show, and I don't think we mentioned it on our last interview with Tulsi last year, but we've certainly talked to her about the assassinations. So they released a ton of stuff, guys, last month, and I've looked through some of them, and other researchers, who've been doing this a lot longer than I have, are combing through them. And the big thing in the news about the records released for the RFK assassination, people are talking about, the autopsy photos, and they are very grim, and they're very stark and really hard to look at. But I think it's important for the complete record to show, where the wounds were. And Noguchi, who's still alive, stands by what he said. And it was a very, even according to RFK Jr., it was a very important, probably one of the most complete and competent and accurate autopsies, because obviously after Dallas, they didn't want to have the same thing happen, to RFK. But of course, there was a cover up. But Noguchi, Thomas Noguchi out in California stands by the autopsy. And of course, he's there publicly talking about what his findings were. And he got politically attacked and smeared and removed from his post. Eventually, he got reinstated, but he had to endure all kinds of attacks and, of his credibility and of his profession. So I think it's important to remember that. So, yeah, if you guys want to just look on your own through the National Archives, you can look at, they have all kinds of letters that came in from people to the Kennedy family and to the government, from citizens all around America and people from all around the world sending in their sympathies and well wishes and their hopes that they had for Senator Kennedy, had he lived. And it's just really, it was 57 years ago, but it wasn't really that long ago. There's still plenty of people around who remember, what they were doing and remember just the national sadness. I mean, there's the footage of the train, taking Bobby back to Washington, D.C., going through the country. And it's just heartbreaking, just seeing all the people with their, taking their hats off, holding their hand and hats to their chest and giving their final respects to Senator Kennedy. And, obviously, like his brother Jack, he wasn't a saint, he was a politician and was in the game and, certainly knew how dangerous that game was. But I really think had he lived, we probably would have gotten out of Vietnam a lot sooner. He would have probably publicly gotten down to the bottom of JFK's death, because he was secretly looking into that behind the scenes. Publicly he had to come out there and say, "Oh yeah, I believe the Warren Commission. It was one person and it was Oswald." But he never believed that from day one, which is interesting. You can read all about that in David Talbot's book, Brothers. He talks about calling up the head of the CIA at the time, a man named McCone, who actually wasn't really someone who had an intelligence background, but he was a loyalist to JFK. So for people who think it was the CIA that killed Kennedy, if it was, or there were elements involved, I don't believe that John McCone knew about it or was involved. I think he was probably just as befuddled as everyone else was. All right, so we'll get back to the CNN article. Okay, so Rhodes Hughes has described the events of 1968 June as the most iconoclastic experience of her life. Although it was years ago, I will swear that this is exactly what happened. I remember it like it was almost yesterday, because you don't forget something like that when it totally changes your life forever. It took a great toll on me. For a while, even the backfiring of a car would send me into tears. Despite the fact her FBI interview summary indicates that she was inside the kitchen pantry during the assassination, she was never called to testify at Sirhan's 1969 trial or at any subsequent inquiry over the years. Rhodes Hughes says she made a point of telling 2 FBI agents in 1968 that she would be willing to make herself available to appear as a witness anywhere at any time to testify that there were more shots. They never wrote that down, she says of the FBI agents who conducted the interview in her Los Angeles home. She also says that when the pair of agents departed their following visit, they forgot to take along their attaché case and minutes later had to return to her residence and retrieve it. She says that in the months following the June 5th, 1968 assassination, she and some others who had been in the Ambassador refused news media interviews so as to avoid interfering with preparations for Sirhan's trial. It wasn't until the 1990s that she was asked whether she would ever be willing to testify under oath an invitation coming not from a prosecutor or law enforcement official, but from author Philip Melanson, who's also written great stuff on the RFK assassination. He was a Chancellor Professor of Policy Studies at UMass Dartmouth. At his request, Rhodes Hughes reviewed her 1968 FBI interview summary for the first time and found it contained more than a dozen inaccuracies. She provided Melanson with a statement, but the professor died some years later, and Rhodes Hughes once again missed her opportunity to testify. Before his death, Melanson published Rhodes Hughes' statement in Shadowplay, a book he co-authored with William Claiborne in 1997, and one of several Melanson wrote on the Robert Kennedy assassination. Defense attorney William Pepper calls Rhodes Hughes' recollections significant verification of new assassination evidence that the Sirhan legal team is currently presenting. It provides further verification of a dozen or more gunshots and mirrors the experience of other witnesses, which confirms the existence of the cover-up efforts, he told CNN. Along with all the other evidence we have provided, one wonders why it has taken so long for this innocent man to be set free, a new trial to be ordered, or at least a full investigatory hearing to be scheduled, Pepper said. Nothing less than the credibility and integrity of the American criminal justice system is at stake in this case. On another side note, another really great researcher and respected guest that we've had on Jacqueline Radio, Laurie Spencer, has done some fantastic work on the RFK assassination. She's been pouring through a lot of the documents that have come out and has a YouTube channel. And I think she's kind of come to the conclusion that Sirhan was guilty, or at least, was firing shots and, knew what he was doing. So I'm not trying to, say that Sirhan doesn't bear any guilt, and we don't even need to get into this too deep because these documentaries go into it, like RFK Must Die. A lot of researchers do feel that Sirhan was manipulated and placed there, which I think is possible. I think it's also possible he could have been in a situation after getting a head injury where he was susceptible to further manipulation and muscling. I mean, the racetrack that he worked at was mob connected, and supposedly he had some gambling issues and owed a lot of money. So he could have been forced to be there for that reason, could have been forced to be there for a number of other reasons, or he could have been some kind of MK Ultra unwitting, against his will. I think those are all possibilities, and I don't think we should be closed off to any of those possibilities. I do think he's, been in prison now for all these years, and he, at the very least, was not the only one involved and took the fall for the others that were involved. So I think it's important to kind of remember that. So Sirhan's current legal team is doing something his original lawyers never did. They are asserting that he did not shoot Kennedy. Sirhan's original defenders had decided at the outset that he was the lone shooter because his initial lawyers presented a diminished capacity case in 1969, and they never pursued available defenses. Evidentiary conflicts and issues such as a possible second gun simply were not addressed at Sirhan's 1969 trial. Most of the original prosecution's evidence was stipulated by the original defense team, which agreed that Sirhan had killed the presidential candidate. Rhodes Hughes' opposition opposes freedom for Sirhan, who she regards as one of the two gunmen firing inside the Ambassador Hotel kitchen pantry. To me, he was absolutely there. I don't feel he should be exonerated. Rhodes Hughes insists the full truth of Robert Kennedy's murder has been suppressed for decades, and she hopes that it will now finally come out and that the alleged second shooter will be identified and brought to justice. There definitely was another shooter, said Rhodes Hughes. The constant cover-ups, the constant lies, this has got to stop. So that was a pretty interesting story and article. Props to CNN back in 2012 for releasing that. I remember, because I've been following the case for so long, that it made some waves. It made some waves back then, but then, like a lot of things, it got memory hold, and you didn't really hear about it after that. So, like I said, in 2023, we actually had the chance to sit down with RFK Jr., and we did just over an hour with him. And you can go to our YouTube channel if you have not seen that interview. It was quite a discussion we had with him, and we got to talk about the JFK assassination and the assassination of his father. And I want to just play here a clip of him talking about his father's shooting, which is pretty heavy. Okay.
Anyway, I always assumed that my uncle was killed by a group. And I always assumed that my father was just killed by Sirhan, and Sirhan was a lone gunman. And then Paul Schrade, who was the United Auto Workers leader, who got shot that night in the head, he took the first bullet and went down, but then he survived. And in fact, I'm going to his funeral tomorrow.
Wow.
I mean, his service.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, and I'm speaking at his service. Paul Schrade made me come to his house and then sat me down with the autopsy report and basically forced me to read it. And once I read that report, I was okay. This guy could not have killed my father, because Sirhan fired 2 shots toward my father before he was grabbed. One of those shots hit the door jamb behind my father. The first shot hit Paul Schrade in the head. The second shot hit a door jamb behind my father and was later removed by the LAPD. Then he was grabbed by Rosie Greer and Rafer Johnson and 6 other men in a dog pile. And the first thing they did was to take his arm and point it away from my father. But they said Rafer said he had superhuman strength. He's this little guy.
Right.
He had superhuman strength, and they couldn't get the gun out of his hand. And he mechanically fired it 6 more times in that direction. And all of those shots away from my father hit people. Oh, there were 5 people hit. One of them was hit twice. So we know what happened to all of his shots. He had 8 shots in his gun, and he never reloaded. The audio shows 13 shots being fired. My father, Sirhan, was always 5.5 feet in front of my dad. My father was killed by 4 shots. He was shot 4 times. One of the shots went harmlessly through the shoulder pad of his jacket. But the 3 shots that killed him were all contact shots. So this is what the autopsy says. When Thomas Noguchi, who was the greatest coroner in American history, said that all of those shots, the gun was either touching my father's clothing or skin, or it was within an inch of him. And because there were carbon tattoos that accompanied them. Sirhan was never behind my father. Sirhan was always in front. There were 77 eyewitnesses, and the guy who was behind him, holding him, was Eugene Thain-Caesar, who was a security guard who worked for Lockheed, and before that, Boeing. He had top secret clearance. He was a CIA guy, and he had gotten that job as security guard 3 days before. And he's the one who grabbed my father by the elbow. My father was not supposed to go through the Ambassador Hotel kitchen. He steered him through the kitchen to the ambush. And, where Sirhan was waiting. And then he had his own gun pulled, which there are a dozen witnesses, and he admitted.
He even said that. Yeah, he fell to the floor and had
my father fell back on him. And my father must have known he was being shot from behind, because he turned and pulled off Caesar's clip-on tie. Caesar had made public statements. He hated my family. He thought my father was, if my father was elected, he was going to give the country away to blacks. This is what he said publicly.
He made statements like that. And then he tried to get $25,000 out of you to go to the Philippines through Dan Bodea. I read that. That's unbelievable.
I wanted to talk to him. And so then his liaison was Dan, who wrote this action fantastic book. He was a police reporter, and he was a really good reporter. And he wrote a book. And if you read that book, you read the entire book, and you're saying, okay, Sirhan definitely killed Robert Kennedy. And then the last chapter, he says, oh, by the way, when I talked to Sirhan, I looked into his eyes and I could tell he was lying. So I know he killed Robert Kennedy. So it was like one of these things where the whole time he builds this impeccable, impervious case. And then the last time he pivots,
Just
the last moment.
switches.
So it's like somebody
Yeah.
talked to him or something.
Yeah. Could be.
And so when I wanted to talk, I got in touch with Cesar through him. And he said, okay, if you give up $10,000, Cesar will talk to you. And I said, okay. And then when we got close to me coming to the event where I was going to fly to the Philippines, he said, it's 25,000 now. And then I just, the whole thing seemed like a scam. And so I didn't do it. And then Cesar died about a year ago.
So there you go. There's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking to Eric and I about the murder of his father and who he thinks actually shot him. Thane Caesar, as you mentioned, was a security guard who was brought in kind of last minute. If this is a man who hated RFK and JFK, why in the world would he be, his bodyguard for that night? So, forensically, it seems like he was in the position best suited to have been the actual gunman who killed RFK, and he even admitted that he did draw his gun when he fell to the floor. And there were a few witnesses who said that they actually saw him firing his gun. So he eventually took off to the Philippines, and he did pass away, I think in 2019 or 2020. So. Yeah, and like I said before, Ryan Dawson, who's done amazing work on this, really goes into the details on his recent appearance on Myron Gaines, which I think everybody here should go and watch. I do have the link included in the description of this video. I also have this documentary here called Israel and the Assassinations of the Kennedy Brothers by Laurent Gainot. And sorry if I'm butchering that name, but that's been kind of a thread that you've heard about more recently, especially with the release of the files and with people learning about the criminality of the state of Israel and with this awful genocide that's being played out and live streamed in real time over the last year and a half. So, if they can do this to innocent people and children and burn them to death and bomb them and blow up hospitals, of course they could be involved in these assassinations and what happened to the USS Liberty and, the urban movers there on 9/11. There's many threads, but, just sticking to the RFK assassination, I just wanted to do a little stream here going over some of this information. And I really appreciate everybody listening and watching. And you can check us out on Podbean, on Apple and iTunes, on YouTube. And if you like our work, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/JackmanRadio. I'm also on Venmo at MikeJackman1986 if you want to shoot me a tip. We do this stuff. It's not behind any kind of paywall. And, this is the stuff that we believe in and we're passionate about and have spent many years researching and reading about. So hopefully today, if you have some time and you're reflecting on the death of Robert F. Kennedy, who was truly a transformative figure in American history, and the echoes of his leadership and his death, I really do believe reverberate to today, and I do believe it's still relevant, and that's why we continue reporting on it and talking about it. So we really appreciate you watching, and we will see you guys again very soon. Take care.